Hi, Peter Charles here, Folk to Fly Fly Fishing, and welcome to my Fly Fishing Beginner Series, and this time we're going to be looking at wet flies, how to fish them. And wet flies is a very broad topic. We're going to be covering a fair bit of ground and a broader spectrum of tackle than you might consider wet flies being used with. It's probably the broadest of all. It's even broader than streamers because you're using a lot of big two-handed rods for swinging wet flies. So we'll get into the types of flies that are out there and also the techniques for swinging these. So let's get started first with the tackle.
Okay, let's look at the tackle we use for swinging wet flies. And keep in mind, we can chase many different species with a wet fly. I even know guys who catch striped bass, including my Achi. I've caught a few striped bass on the swung fly as well. So there are plenty of ways to catch lots of different species using the wet fly approach. So let's get looking at the tackle I'm using here. As far as rods are concerned, this is a 4-weight, 8.5 foot NRX plus 4-weight. Quite typical of what we might use to swing a wet fly for trout. You really don't need anything dedicated to wet fly fishing. Pretty well any rod is going to do the job, though I think some people like softer action rods for wet fly fishing. Makes perhaps the initial hit easier to hook up, in their opinion, which is fine. If it works for you, go for it. But frankly, I think any fly rod in the trout range is going to work for swinging wet flies. As far as reels are concerned, again, resident trout, you don't need anything fancy. This is just a click and pull. And as far as lines are concerned, this is just a standard, that's a presentation taper fly line, floating fly line. That'll do the job quite well for you. Now, I do use intermediate lines a lot for swinging wet flies, but you don't have to. You can use just a standard trout floater. If that's all you have, that'll do the job. And what those flies look like, here's a sample of some trout wet flies. You can see some of them have collars, some of them have wings, and they're designed to move well, be colorful. Some are quite imitative, and some are just colorful and meant to attract fish just through the bright colors. But they have a lot of movement when they're swung, and that's what makes them work. And so when you're fishing for trout, you're generally using something like a partridge in orange or a leadwing coachman or anything of that nature. Winged wets or what they call soft tackle wets. Trout love them. And they imitate that stage of the insect where it's coming up to hatch. And that's what we're imitating with those flies. Now, you also use wet flies for steelhead and salmon. And let's take a look at some of those. These tend to be brighter, and they don't often imitate a specific insect or bait fish. They're just designed to attract fish with bright colors and lots of movement. And, both steelhead and salmon will take these flies. Now, what are you using for especially salmon and steelhead? What are we using for gear? Well, I've got this NRX Plus 8-weight, 9-foot 8-weight, and I've got an 8-weight line on it, and it's this Airflow Exceed. Now, the thing about fishing for species like salmon and steelhead, you better have a reel with a good drag. Unlike trout, where it's not that important, really important with these fish because they really run, and you will see your backing. So if you want to go with the single-handed rod for salmon or steelhead, you're looking anywhere from a 7 to a 9-weight, 9-foot to 10-foot. That'll do the job for you. However, what about this beastie? This is 13.5 foot long. Some people call these spey rods. If in the UK, they're called salmon rods. And the idea behind these big two-handers is to cast far. I mean, really, when you're fishing for salmon or steelhead with these rods, the idea is to be able to cover a lot of water when you're swinging a wet fly. And that's why we have them, and that's why they're so long. They give you the ability to cast quite far. So you can see the tackle that we use is quite varied, and the flies are quite varied, from very small. I mean, I've gone down to, I think, a size 22 in a wet fly, all the way up to honking great 2/0 flies that are about that long. And you get big tube flies is another thing you'll see for salmon and steelhead. So there's lots of variety in wet fly fishing. And they all do basically the same thing, though. They're swung on a tight line in current. And that crash from a fish is just something we all live for, is just get that wham. So there's the tackle.
Okay, here's a perfect example of swinging a wet fly in a slow current for brown trout. I'm putting a little bit of movement into the fly because the current is so slow. If I was fishing a faster current, I wouldn't have to do that. I could just let it swing. But in this softer flow, you've got to give the fly a little bit of life, and I'm rewarded with a nice take from a small brown. Okay, here I am casting across a stream with a reach mend, and I'm dead drifting the fly. I am not pulsing it, or I'm not swinging it in current. I'm just letting it dead drift like it was a dry fly. And I'm rewarded with a take and a small brown with that dead drift approach. So you're not limited to just casting downstream and swinging it on a tight line. You can also catch fish very, very easily by dead drifting this fly and even casting it upstream. So remember that it's not just a downstream approach. Here's another example. I'm casting slightly upstream, and then I'm retrieving line. I have to retrieve a bit of line to keep the line tight in case a fish was to take it at that point. And wet fly fishing isn't just for casting and fishing at long distance. Here I am targeting a specific fish that I had seen. It's just a little bit off the frame of the camera. And I'm just casting a short line and drifting out a short line. You don't have to cast far. You can treat this just like dry fly fishing. Oh, I had one on there for a second. And, as I say, just target a fish, drift down to it at short range, and it works just fine. Okay, here I'm swinging a fly downstream for smallmouth bass. I'm going to show you it's just as effective for bass as it is for trout. I'm swinging on a tight line through a deeper hole and rewarded with a decent bass. And swinging flies isn't just for smallmouth and trout. Here I am swinging a fly for carp. And same basic presentation as I was using for trout and bass, but here we go. We've got a nice carp picking up my fly and giving me more tussle than I can handle. Man, I love catching carp. For a lot of people, swinging wet flies for either steelhead or salmon is the ultimate. I mean, I just absolutely adore swinging wet flies. It doesn't matter if it's for Pacific salmon or Atlantic salmon or steelhead. I mean, we just live for this kind of thing. And the two-ended rod gives you the ability to cast really far and cover a lot of water if you have to. And the takes are epic. I mean, when you get a big fish on the end and it just smashes your fly, I mean, it does something to you. I mean, it really gets the blood pumping. And then the fights are epic, and especially in cold water like I am today. I mean, this is November, late November. It's very cold, and the fish are very active, and they fight very hard. And landing them in the middle of the river is always a challenge, but that's part of the fun. I mean, this is why we love swinging flies. And here's this beautiful hen that I'm just bringing in, and I'm going to release her. Here we go. Okay, there's our little discussion about wet flies. It's a great way to fish. I love fishing wet flies. I fish them for resident trout, for Atlantic salmon, for steelhead. I've caught carp on them. I've caught channel catfish on them. And when you're swinging a wet fly, a lot of different species. Oh, I forgot walleye. I get walleye in swung wet fly as well. A lot of different species will hit a swung wet fly, and it's a lot of fun. In steelhead circles, they talk about the tug being the drug, that whang when a big fish takes it hard. So, I mean, it's a great lot of fun to get a fish on a wet fly. And it's probably one of my favorite ways of fishing. So if you've never tried it before, give fishing wet flies a try. It is a blast. Cheers.